Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, a poll has come out a few days ago about how Americans are, in fact, evenly divided. And this has been shown a number of times over the past number of years, so it's not the first time that Americans are essentially evenly divided on whether the war in Afghanistan was a mistake, i.e. U.S. and NATO involvement in that war. This is certainly important in the context of the fact that the U.S. is now walking away from Afghanistan, so to speak, and there is a lot of talk about a possible Taliban takeover and what this may mean for Afghans as well as the Kabul government, etc. There's also then the huge issue of lives that have been lost, American service members' lives who have been lost in Afghanistan, if all of that was worth it. And then on top of that, also the financial cost, around $2 trillion plus has been spent, according to many estimates, during the Afghan war on the part of the United States. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. John Ciorciari, who is an associate professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. He is joining us this morning from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Sean McFate, who is a professor at Georgetown University. He's also the author of The New Rules of War. And joining us from Ottawa, Ontario, is Irfan Yar, who is the founder and managing director, of the Afghanistan Security Institute, ASI. Irfan, Sean, and John, thank you to all three of you for your time this morning. John, let me start with you. I guess that if we have Americans evenly divided about the Afghan war and whether or not it was worth it, this probably goes back to obviously 9/11, as was said to all of us was the reason that the Americans went into Afghanistan. Was it worth it in your own opinion?
I think that it was. It doesn't mean that the war was always executed well, and it doesn't mean that every aspect of the strategy or the state-building effort in Afghanistan were warranted or were successful. But I think when we look at these polling figures, we have to disaggregate a little bit between the popular views of the merits of going after al-Qaeda and denying it a stronghold after 9/11, and the merits of the much longer-term state-building enterprise in Afghanistan, which by most accounts has not been very successful.
Irfan, what are your thoughts on that? I know that you study Afghanistan very, very closely and you have connections to it. Was this war worth it, especially now that we're speaking in the year 2021 about the U.S. walking away?
Well, in my opinion, of course not. It was not worth it at all. Invading Afghanistan was not just a mistake. I think it was one of the biggest blunder in the American history, simply because it did way more bad than it did good. And just like 20 years ago, President Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan from the same treaty room where Biden ordered the exit of Afghanistan. Like after 20 years, the war is going nowhere. It started with the Taliban, and now it seems that it will end with the Taliban. So it did not really go anywhere except that massive amount of treasure was spent and hundreds of thousands of people were killed until the day the violence, is escalated. And U.S. also admits this mistake. U.S. Secretary Antony Blinken, recently stated in New Delhi that the Afghanistan war has no military solution. So my question is what they were doing for the 20 years. So like after 20 years, they realized that there is no military solution for the Afghan conflict. And this is the proof that they also, the high-level official also admit that it was a mistake. And what does it show? I think it showed that the Bush administration, miscalculated the consequences of going to, Afghanistan, or maybe his decision was, to more based on emotional to give, a response to the American collective psychological need for the revenge of September 11 attack.
In fact, I wanted to ask you about that. To be fair to George W. Bush, the pressure on him probably was quite significant at that time, right? Right in the wake of 9/11. Was it a case of he really had no choice but to do this?
No, the president always has choices. The choice he made was to go into Afghanistan initially to root out al-Qaeda. But then in December of that year, in 2002 or 2001, they had a conference in Bonn globally where they decided to shift it from counterterrorism to nation building. And I think that is what is specifically the failure to achieve this, is that nations cannot be built, at least not in the cut and paste manner of Western perspectives. And the United States and others tried to do that. It was a failure. It left, I think, Afghanistan even more destabilized than when the U.S. went in.
John, we've been very critical of the U.S. role, but then there's been many people who have said a lot has been achieved, especially in, if I may use the word bubble, of where the Kabul government over the years, and I'm speaking about all the Kabul governments over the years, that they've been able to achieve some form of freedom, progress in rights, etc. Just within that bubble, then, do you think it was worth it? I mean, because if the U.S. is now walking away, I mean, that bubble will burst fairly soon too, won't it?
Well, I think that for people who operate within the various bubbles that the government controls in Afghanistan, many would likely say that that the war effort and elements of the state-building effort in Afghanistan have been worth it, in the sense that they have provided an opportunity for girls to go to school, for ethnic minorities to operate at least within those bubbles at times more safely. I don't think any Afghan would say that the ISAF or NATO-led efforts in Afghanistan have been unvarnished successes, but I do think that now that the American-led coalition is pulling back in Afghanistan, there are many people who are extremely concerned for their safety and their well-being, and keen to find ways to maintain some of the modest areas of progress that did occur in the country during this American intervention. That's not to say that every aspect of the American involvement has been successful. Certainly not, as my colleagues have said. But I do think that there have been some modest areas of success. There's also the important issue that we have to consider the counterfactual. What would Afghanistan and its security environment have looked like absent the intervention? There's no doubt, as my colleagues have alluded to, that there's been insecurity in the country for a long time, including during the period of U.S. involvement. There also would have been forms of insecurity absent that involvement, and we have to consider what those might look like. It's certainly conceivable that continued Taliban rule and existence of terror safe havens in Afghanistan would have produced equally bad or even worse outcomes for many Afghan civilians.
And that's good, isn't it, Irfan? What if the U.S. had not gotten involved? What would Afghanistan look like today?
This is a very interesting, point to figure out. Like nobody knows, maybe it would have been possible that the situation would have been better than it is now, both in terms of security and development. When we talk about the achievements, in the last 20 years, we talk about the state building. As my colleague mentioned rightly, there has been a relative, progress in women's education in general also. But if the Taliban were in power, maybe the same thing could happen. They would let, with time, the girls to go to school and get educated because of the international pressure, because of the globalization. So, the situation may, would have been different. And in my opinion, it could have been more positive.
So, Sean, if the U.S. had not gotten involved, I mean, of course, there's the one aspect of how this would have affected Afghanistan, present-day Afghanistan, what it may have looked like today. But then what of the Americans themselves, right? And American involvement overseas? Had the U.S. not immediately gotten involved in Afghanistan, what would American policy around the world look like right now? I mean, did this have a huge impact, do you think, that then led to, for example, the Iraq War as well?
Yes, I mean, it's a really interesting question, hypotheticals. Look, to Americans, Afghanistan and Iraq are sort of bound together. I know that's not how people in Afghanistan think about it, but that's how people in America think about it. And both began, well, why Iraq began is a whole different question. But Afghanistan began as a counterterrorism mission to go after al-Qaeda. And they did that. And then it changed into a nation-building exercise. And, al-Qaeda left Afghanistan by 2002, 2003, and they spread around the world, around the Middle East, around parts of sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. And yet the United States focused on Afghanistan to the neglect of those other regions. I think this maximalist approach in U.S. foreign policy, and I'd agree with my colleague in Ontario, has been one of the worst failures of American foreign policy in modern history, not the entire history, but in modern history. And it has weakened U.S. standing around the world. It has cost American blood and treasure, and it's cost a lot of blood in those regions and destabilized the Middle East. It's destabilized parts of South Asia. We know that for a fact. Could it have been more stable or less stable if the U.S. had not been there for so long? It's an interesting discussion, but ultimately it's unknowable.
Yeah, so I mean, John, my question then remains at this point that when Afghanistan at the beginning, I mean, I would think that in the American point of view, American government and official point of view, Afghanistan was probably going well in their minds because they were able to create these bubbles, as you also described in your earlier answer, where the Kabul government had control. But then, you know, they went from that very soon into then Iraq, right? So do you think that at this point now, all these years later, that the lessons have actually been learned that weren't learned between those years of, you know, Afghanistan and then Iraq?
In a sense, I think lessons have been learned. I agree with what Sean and Irfan have said about the dangers of maximalist objectives and overreach in places like Afghanistan with regard to nation building or state building. But there's also the question of whether those lessons actually could be implemented in a future scenario in which the United States was involved in a faraway place with severe governance deficiencies. Many of the decisions made, particularly in the latter stages of this conflict, have not been made because people in Washington had any consensus that the operations were going well or the state building initiatives were succeeding, but because there's a kind of inertia and also a set of different constituencies in Congress and in the public and internationally to which they're responding. In that sense, that we could think of this a little bit as a quicksand problem. Once the initial decisions are made to try to do what sounds good, which is to implant democratic institutions and so on, one becomes beholden then to the results, and that has a quicksand type of effect. And I think this is one reason why, to go back to the start of the piece today, why public opinion is so divided. The public no longer sees the rationale for this long extended conflict, and the governing elites have had trouble getting out.
So Irfan, what does this then mean for Afghans going forward and the Afghan experience throughout these years? Do you see that there was progress made in some regards? Do you think that that progress can be preserved in those areas that we have had positive progress in the country because many would point to the U.S. presence or NATO presence? You know, what does the future look like? Because, I mean, throughout, it's always been discussed that, I mean, this is the same with Iraq as well, that we haven't discussed enough of the innocent lives that have been lost right throughout this. So be it Afghan lives or Iraqi lives, in this case, Afghan lives. Do you think that now we will finally have Afghans feeling like they are valued?
Well, the first thing I would say is, you know, there was some, you know, like progress that nobody can ignore, and we should always, you know, cherish those. For example, the introduction of democracy to Afghanistan, even though all people do not have a good image of democracy in Afghanistan, but still for a long term, it's a good introduction. And those things, you know, should be kept, you know, in Afghanistan. And another way that I can put it is that it's most for American, you know, audience is that whenever they are going to some place like Afghanistan, they should always, you know, take in consideration the indigenous culture. What happened was, like, after 9/11, U.S. intervened in Afghanistan, and they, you know, they swiftly, you know, and brutally, you know, destroyed the Taliban regime within few weeks. However, within few years, the Taliban re-emerged as a strong and, you know, resilient insurgency. And what the Americans did not do was they did not take, you know, the Afghan audience as a strategic partners, and the Taliban, you know, utilized that opportunity. They started from the village, they more interacted with the people on the village and the grassroots level, and this is how, you know, they become more stronger and popular in rural Afghanistan, and then, you know, took back on the American forces. So that was, you know, one of the biggest lessons that should be learned, you know, we shall and never repeat in any major war.
Sean, for many people, yes, getting involved was a bad thing, and I'm speaking from this part of the world, that getting involved was a bad thing on the part of the Americans/NATO, but then now in this fashion to walk away is also very, very irresponsible, because it's almost like giving people a glimmer of hope in a sense of regarding those things which are positive, and then just now saying, you know what, we're going to walk away, so we can't promise that this is going to remain. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts that there's no easy way to leave, for the U.S. to leave Afghanistan. I think, John was correct that this is like a sandpit for policymakers. And, there's been a lot of skepticism about Afghanistan's U.S. involvement in Afghanistan for 10 years, but nobody could figure out how to gracefully leave. And also the Soviets had the same problem in '89. And they too had achieved some of these things, education for women and et cetera. And we know how that ended. And I don't think anybody in Washington is, except for maybe a few, are painting this with glossy good news hope. I don't see another alternative. However, to your original question about this poll, America Divided, I think that is misleading. I think most Americans, probably could not find Afghanistan on a globe. And many of them think it's part of the Middle East. And also less than 1% of the United States serves in the military, so they have no sort of skin in the game about staying. They don't want to leave because it looks like defeat, so it's like, let's just stay, but we don't actually have to stay. But I think what this poll reflects is actually the culture war that's going on in America right now between Republicans, Democrats, blue and red, CNN and Fox. And I think it really is, it's being subsumed with an internal discourse in the United States of America that has very little to do with Afghanistan in reality.
John, I'm going to give you the final word before I let all three of you go. What does the future then hold for U.S. involvement overseas? Are the American people, do you think, at a point where they would not be ready for more military interventions overseas?
That certainly is the mood at the moment, and we have a very good example of that in Haiti, where the Haitian interim prime minister called for U.S. military support to deal with the prospect of a meltdown in that country after the assassination of their president, Moise. And the Biden administration poured cold water on that and said that the United States is not contemplating a military intervention in Haiti. That's an instance in which the exodus of Haitians could cause significant concern for the United States and other regional partners. But at this moment, looking at the legacy of Afghanistan and the lessons we've been discussing, the United States' inclination is not to get back deeply involved. I don't know how long that mood will last, or whether there will be a crisis that shakes the United States back into a more interventionist mode. But for the moment, that's very much the mood in the country and in Washington.
All right, we'll leave. Well, we really appreciate John, Sean, and Irfan for taking their time out this morning, speaking to us from Ottawa, Washington, and Ann Arbor, respectively. We were discussing there this poll that has come out, this Gallup poll, showing that the Americans are evenly divided at this point when it comes to whether or not the Afghan war was even worth it. Does this show apathy on the part of many Americans? The fact that, as Sean mentioned, many Americans probably cannot, in fact, even locate Afghanistan on a map, probably shows that there is a significant level of disconnect with what's happened on the ground in Afghanistan, even throughout these years. As Irfan there mentioned, in his opinion, it was not worth it. But at the same time, I mean, at least from my point of view and vantage point, it would seem that George W. Bush was under a lot of political pressure at the time to somehow seek revenge for 9/11. So in that sense, was it, quote unquote, mission accomplished, as George W. said? These are very heavy duty questions, but they're really, really important to ask, because you would hope that the Americans have learned the lesson that innocent lives lost in this fashion, money wasted in this fashion, is simply not worth it. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a topic we have not discussed on this show before, and that is agriculture or food politics, as we may understand it. And this is often something that's not discussed a lot in mainstream media because it's a heavy-duty topic, seemingly, because we're talking about agribusiness, we're talking about big corporations versus peasants, farmers. And we have spoken a bit about this in certain contexts, such as Indian farmers and the seeds that they were given, as well as some farmers around the world as well. But now we have a sort of a boycott movement, if I may use that term, boycott, against the UN Global Food Systems Summit, which is to be held in September in New York. Now, a lot of organizers of the summit are pitching it as a crucial debate of the decade, in their words, to define the future of agriculture. But for a lot of the smaller players, such as, as I mentioned, indigenous movements, organized peasant movements in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, pretty much everywhere in the world, they're saying that, in fact, this should be boycotted because this basically just represents big agribusiness interests. Is that true? Are their arguments legitimate? Then what's a better way? There is also, from what I've understood, a counter summit that has been proposed and set up as well. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Glenn Denning, who is a professor of practice at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He's joining us today from Brisbane in Australia. Joining us from Durham, New Hampshire, is Dr. Yvonne M. Vissing, who is a professor at the Department of Healthcare Studies and director for the Center of Childhood and Youth Studies, and is policy chair of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. She is affiliated with Salem State University. And joining us from Phoenix, Arizona, is Dr. Henry Thomson, who is an assistant professor of political economy at Arizona State University. Henry, Glenn, and Yvonne, thank you to all three of you for taking our time out of your busy schedules for us today. Henry, let me start with you, if I may. The criticisms of this Global Food Systems Summit as representing big agribusiness, is that a legitimate accusation?
Well, I'd say that remains to be seen, or is somewhat unclear from my perspective, but I do think that there are always legitimate concerns by smallholders in agriculture that they really struggle to organise and make their voices heard in the policy-making process, even at the national level, let alone at the international level. It's sort of a law of social science that large groups of poorly endowed economic actors like small farmers find it very, very difficult to organise and lobby governments, whereas large farmers, small groups of larger farmers, or perhaps even more effectively, corporations find it much easier to lobby governments.
On what needs to change then? Do we need to have these smaller players being given a bigger role?
Absolutely. I work with the UN on child rights issues, and I think that the UN has done a lot of good work for the children of the world. But I think that we're at a critical time where there's hunger, there's homelessness, there's all kinds of environmental issues that are going to be difficult for children to be sustainable in the long run, to have enough to eat. So what we are doing is not working. And so we have to figure out a different way. For me, I think that a rights-respecting framework is an important one. In the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then in the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, they all talk about the importance of food, as does the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I think that it is important that we look at systems and where they're failing, and to create dialogue where the voice of everyone is heard and not just agribusiness.
Glenn, if you can, just for a moment, put this into context for us about why it would be a bad thing, or why it is a bad thing if we just have big agribusiness corporations essentially leading these sorts of summits and leading the charge when it comes to how then we have agriculture around the world.
Well, I completely agree. It would not be a good thing if agribusiness was leading a global food summit. Everything I understand about the way the UN operates and around how this summit is organized does not in any way suggest that agribusiness, or certainly not big agribusiness or any form of agribusiness, is actually leading it. So, I actually agree with both of the previous speakers in the importance of having all of this work embedded in human rights. There is a right to food, and also the importance of smallholder farmers. 500 million smallholder farmers, 2 billion people depending on smallholder farmers. I think that's got to be, front and center in the conference. And I think, you mentioned earlier, this is a heavy duty topic. Well, it really is. This is life and death for people. There's half the world's population is either not eating enough or eating too much. So we do have a crisis on our hands, affecting a very large number of people and affecting the environment. Resource degradation, deforestation, climate change, all of these issues are real. And I think we need all hands on deck. We need everybody at the table, including agribusiness.
Henry, the image, I would think, in many people's minds in the developed world is that, listen, agribusiness is good for us because it ensures a steady supply for us, i.e. those sitting in the developed world in their supermarket, on their supermarket shelves, etc. But that could very well change as well, couldn't it? Because we do have climate change now, not even slowly, but in fact quite quickly affecting even the developed world. I mean, we recently had flooding in London. I know that's just one fairly small example and it doesn't affect agribusiness wholly, but I mean, things could very quickly get worse even for the first world.
Well, I think the image of big agribusiness in developed countries politically is also not as positive as you might assume or as you just portrayed it. So big agribusiness is under a lot of political attacks, particularly from the left, as harvesting large amounts of government subsidies, as perhaps perpetuating environmental degradation, as you outlined. So agribusiness is not perhaps as well loved in mass politics as it used to be, although agribusiness, large agricultural corporations, large landowners are still relatively effective political advocates for their own interests, both at the national and at the international level. And so the sort of summits that they're organising here through the UN are really useful. They're really well-intentioned. They address directly the sustainable development goals that have been laid out by the United Nations. But smallholder farmers are still going to face significant obstacles in mobilising to influence their national governments and also to influence this sort of a forum. There are a lot of really diverse players who are included in the forum. If you go to the forum's website and read about their agenda and about the people that are involved, there's a really diverse group of people, including representatives of smallholders, but that doesn't necessarily represent the type of discussions that are going to go on at the forum, let alone any type of policy changes that might be implemented here. I think it's really important also to remember that this is just a forum. It's a venue for governments and civil society actors to discuss food and agriculture. The real venue for policy changes in the agricultural sector is the World Trade Organization, which hasn't passed any significant changes in agricultural trade and tariff policy for many years, for 2 decades now. And that is one way that smallholders could be very, very considerably helped, but that just doesn't look like it's going to happen.
Yvonne, in my mind, the most pertinent example that comes up in my mind when we're speaking about agribusiness and misuse by big corporations, big agribusiness corporations around the world of their power is things like Monsanto seeds. And I don't mean to just pick on Monsanto, but it's an easy example to pick on because of the kind of detrimental effect it had in many, many farming communities in many countries, such as India, that I mentioned at the top of this segment. Do you think that they can even be reined in, or is it a question of almost like the financial crisis where they're too big to fail?
That's a great question. I'm just finishing a book on globalization, ideology, and human rights. And what we're finding is that there's this big argument on globalization and the role of multinational corporations like Monsanto, and trying to say, are they really being helpful or not? And the debate is a lively one. And I think that the protests that we've seen around the summit are really helpful to create a dialogue and discussion around key issues. So they could be reined in. However, not while there's so much vested interest. The power of the people to have a voice and to remember why we are doing what we're doing. The whole emphasis of the summit originally was to make sure that people didn't go hungry and that there was sustainability in our environment so that we could grow crops and feed people for future generations. And have we missed that mark by allowing corporations to keep making more and more money and forcing the little farmers out of business, relying on technology and creating plants that you can't, the seeds that won't grow anything after the first generation?
Glenn, that's a good point that Yvonne there made, right? And I use the Monsanto seeds example only because, as I said, that's the one that I know that has had impact, especially in the region where I'm sitting or close by. Do you think that there is a disconnect then, which is the danger really on the part of big agribusiness with then local communities and the kind of effect that their decision making then has?
Yeah, I think the disconnect is that those large multinational firms are actually generating science technology primarily for their own farmers, for their own larger scale farmers around the world. And they play that role, and that's globalization, that's global trade. But what I see when I look at smallholder farmers around the world is that you kind of have almost a scientific apartheid with them, that they're not getting any of these scientific riches that the farmers in Iowa and in Brazil and those places are getting from advances in things like genomics, like data science, like precision agriculture. These are absolutely primarily focused on industrial agriculture, large-scale mechanized farming in the rich world. So I think what the summit should do is ask questions of those large firms and bring in business of all shapes and sizes and have them focus on the needs of the 500 million small-scale farmers that are scattered far and wide around the world. I think we want the big multinationals at the table, but we want them to start focusing on the needs of the global food system in its totality, and not just where the market is currently sending them, because the big guys are the ones who pay for the inputs. The problem in many parts of the world is farmers don't have the resources to be able to pay for those. So I think more focus on smallholder farmers is absolutely essential.
Basically, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right? At the same time, though, I would think that the argument would be made then this is really then complex, because if we're meant to then contextualize how we react to the various food crises in respective communities around the world, and that's a huge undertaking. WTO, I mean, who should be leading that effort then?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one that's vexed the World Trade Organization and agricultural negotiations now for over 20 years. So you're right, a sort of a top-down approach to these sorts of very complex global problems is extremely difficult. And so these discussions at the upcoming food forum are likely going to be lengthy and come up with many different plans related to the Sustainable Development Goals, which themselves are, of course, incredibly complex. And the hope is then that there will be some action, some movement, but of course these sorts of global problems are very, very difficult to achieve. Now there are, of course, other policy measures in trade and pricing policy, tariff policy, where governments can commit to or actually reduce their interventions in agricultural markets to allow markets to respond to things like weather shocks, price shocks, changes in agricultural markets around the world in a way that more efficiently allocates resources, to put it quite simply. But those sorts of negotiations, those sorts of reductions in agricultural market distortions have not been particularly successful over the last 20 years because large developed countries, mostly under the strong influence of very well-organized agricultural lobbies and agribusiness lobbies. Large wealthy countries have resisted reductions in agricultural tariffs, and developing countries have therefore resisted themselves making concessions in other policy areas. So the World Trade Organization, primarily the European Union, and a few countries like Japan, South Korea, Norway, and Switzerland have continuously blocked moves to reduce distortions in agricultural markets, to free up agricultural trade, and to basically increase prices and trade opportunities for agricultural sectors in developing countries. And that has really stymied a more global, integrated approach to solving a lot of these problems, which can be solved or addressed to a large degree through market liberalization and allowing markets to respond to shocks and crises.
Yvonne, we have just about a minute and a half left, so I'll give you the final word. What needs to happen at the summit, do you think, that would be a reasonable step forward? I mean, we've discussed these problems and they're all complex, so it's not like things are going to happen and change overnight, but what would a good first step be, in your opinion?
A good first step would be to have an honest dialogue among all the parties and have everyone have a seat at the table. They talk about it, but then they don't do it. I think that we have to address the issue of whose side are we on in this summit. And if we are on the side of humanity and children and the people who are hungry, then that should be our emphasis instead of profits for the multinational corporations.
Well, we'll leave it there at that. We really appreciate Yvonne, Glenn, and Henry for putting this all into context for us. As I said, this is a topic which is not discussed a lot in media because, as Glenn there also mentioned, it is a heavy-duty topic, but it's extremely important because we're talking then about our food supplies, all of our food supplies around the world, be it in the developed world or the developing world, be us dependent on local farmers or big corporations for our food supplies. These sorts of decisions that big multinational corporations halfway across the world make then for our farmers sitting in this part of the world, that's just a huge disconnect, is it not? And one hopes that a summit like this that would take place under the UN auspices can actually start a dialogue, as Yvonne there mentioned at the end, to in fact reform this system so that it actually does reflect local realities, local challenges, because not every single country, not every single community has the exact same challenge as the other. So we cannot have a one-size-fits-all solution for the global food crises, malnutrition, hunger, etc., something that Yvonne had also mentioned in one of her answers. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.